Hey guys, welcome back to CCL Biology, the channel for easy to understand biology lessons. If you're looking for help with general, AP, or even college introductory biology, you are in the right place. I am your friendly bio nerd. Thank you so much for tuning into my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about lipids, which you probably know as fats. So if you want to get a better understanding of lipids, then stay tuned. While you're here, don't forget to hit the like button and comment below if you find this video to be helpful. And if you want more easy to understand biology lessons, then be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell to get updates for new videos as soon as they come out. This video is part 1 of lipids. Here, we're going to take a look at what lipids are, and then we'll focus specifically on fats. In part 2, we'll look at steroids and phospholipids, 2 other types of lipids. So first off, what is a lipid? Well, let's talk about some of the things that it's not. Lipids are different from the other 3 biomolecules, that's proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, because they're not built with monomers and polymers. Now be sure to check out my video on macromolecules where I talk more about monomers and polymers. I'll put the link to that video in the description box below. Lipids are also different from the other 3 because they don't get as big in size, which is why they're technically not macromolecules. But even with these differences, lipids are usually grouped with carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids as macromolecules or biomolecules. So now that we've talked a little bit about what lipids are not, let's go back to what they are. We know they're organic or carbon-containing, as all the biomolecules are. But what makes an organic compound a lipid rather than a carbohydrate, a protein, or a nucleic acid? Lipids are organic compounds that are hydrophobic, meaning they're not attracted to water. Now, lipids are a pretty diverse group. As you can see here in these illustrations, all of these are lipids, although they're 4 completely different things. But what all lipids have in common is that they are not attracted to water, either very, very little attraction or no attraction at all. And we're going to look at the structure of lipids to see why they don't like water. Let's focus here in this video on 3 types of lipids that are important for biology. That's fats, phospholipids, and steroids. We're all familiar with fat, right? Well, let's talk about it at the biological molecular level. A fat molecule is made of 2 smaller molecules, glycerol and fatty acids. So again, this is different from the other 3 biomolecules. Each of those biomolecules, carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids, has a monomer, which is an individual unit, that joins with identical or similar monomers to build polymers. Think about it like a pearl joining with another pearl and another pearl to make a pearl necklace, or one train car attached to another train car or another train car on a train. All right, so here the scenario is a little different. We don't have one singular monomer unit joining with another identical or similar monomer. We have 2 completely different smaller molecules. But the glycerol and the fatty acid do come together through a dehydration reaction to build that fat molecule. So fats do have that in common with the other biomolecules. Again, check out my video about macromolecules where I talk about dehydration reactions. So let's take a look at the 2 smaller molecules. Glycerol is an alcohol with 3 carbons. So when we're looking at the structure here, notice you don't see the letter C to designate carbon. You do see these OHs, which are hydroxyl groups, and that's what makes this glycerol an alcohol. Now the carbons are here at the kind of like the intersections of these lines or the corners where there's no letter. So that's 1, 2, 3 carbons. So glycerol is an alcohol with 3 carbons, and each carbon, as we can see, is attached to a hydroxyl group, and that's what makes this an alcohol. Now, if you want to learn more about hydroxyl groups, check out my video about chemical groups. I'll link that below as well. Now, the fatty acid is a hydrocarbon skeleton, which just means it has hydrogens and carbons all over it. Now, it can vary in its length, but it's usually about 16 to 18 carbons long. And again, those carbon atoms are bonded to hydrogen atoms, like we can see here. At one end of the skeleton is a carboxyl group, also called a carboxylic acid. So that's this COOH, this carbon, 2 oxygens, and a hydrogen. So this is why this chain is called a fatty acid, because it has this carboxylic acid here at the end. Now let's go back to the glycerol part. The hydroxyl groups here on this glycerol molecule are polar, which means that they like water. But the carbon and hydrogen bonds in the hydrocarbon skeleton are nonpolar. And because that hydrocarbon skeleton makes up the majority of a fat molecule, it makes the entire fat molecule nonpolar or hydrophobic. Now we can see the hydrophobicity of fat in action when we put oil and water in the same container. Oil is a lipid. They're going to stay separate from each other because the hydrocarbon chains in the oil are repelled from the water. So you've probably heard since you were a kid that oil and water don't mix. Essentially, it's because oil is hydrophobic. It's not attracted to water. Okay, so now that we've talked about the two parts of a fat molecule, let's take a look at how they come together. To build the fat molecule, we have one glycerol molecule that's going to bond with 3 individual fatty acid chains. So I've got one fatty acid chain here. This is oleic acid. This is just one type of fatty acid. So the dehydration reaction is going to happen here. So it's going to be between the hydroxyl group of the glycerol molecule, this OH, and the hydroxyl group of the carboxylic acid on the fatty acid chain. So here's the carboxylic acid, the COOH, and here's the OH hydroxyl group. So that's where the dehydration reaction is going to happen. Okay, so here's another illustration where we can see the reaction. So again, I've got a glycerol molecule here. You see my 3 hydroxyl groups. And here, this is just a representation of 3 fatty acid chains. It's just showing the carboxylic acid part because that's where the reaction happens. So let's start here at the top. So we have this hydroxyl group here, and then this hydroxyl group on the fatty acid chain. We're going to have a dehydration, which is going to take away 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So if we follow along here, okay, we see that same H2C, that hasn't changed. Now we see just 1 oxygen. So again, we've gotten rid of 2 of the hydrogens and the other oxygen. So we have just 1 oxygen here, now bringing this, this part of the glycerol molecule together with this carboxylic acid. All right, the same thing happens here in the middle. Follow that there. And then down here at the bottom. So with these dehydration reactions, we're getting bonds in between the glycerol molecule and the fatty acid. So these bonds here, these 3 bonds are called ester linkages or ester bonds, E-S-T-E-R. So this is going to happen 3 times to connect all 3 fatty acids to the same glycerol molecule. So make sure you catch that. It's one and the same glycerol molecule binding to 3 separate fatty acid chains to build that fat molecule. Now the fatty acids don't have to be identical. As long as we've got 3 of them bonded to the glycerol molecule, we've got a fat molecule. And this is why fats are also called triglycerides or triacyl glycerols. The tri is indicating that there are 3 fatty acid molecules bound to the glycerol. You've likely heard about saturated and unsaturated fat, right? They're big topics in the health and nutrition world. Let's take a look at these 2. What's the difference? And why is one considered better for us than the other? To understand the difference, let's talk about the word saturated. It means to be filled with something. Now, in terms of fats, saturation is talking about hydrogens. How many hydrogen atoms are in the fatty acid regions of the molecule? Now, a saturated fat is one in which all 3 of the fatty acid chains are completely filled with hydrogen. What that means is that each carbon in the chain is connected to as many hydrogen atoms as it can be. So if we look at these internal carbons, or the carbons on the inside, they're each going to be connected to 2 hydrogens. That's the maximum amount of hydrogens they can be connected to, because they're also connected to a carbon on each side. So they have room for only 2 more atoms, and you get 2 hydrogens. The external carbon here, the one at the end, is bound to only 1 carbon, so it can bind to 3 more atoms, and it's filled with hydrogens. So the whole acid chain is completely filled. Saturated fatty acid chains have no double bonds. I talk more about double bonds in my video about covalent bonds. I'll put that link below. Right, so here's another illustration of a saturated fat. So again, you don't see too many letters represented here. You don't see the C's and the H's for the carbons and the hydrogens, but we know that each of the points represents a carbon bound to a hydrogen. So you see no, don't pay attention to these double bonds here. This is the carboxylic acid. There's always going to be that double bond between the carbon and the oxygen. But from one carbon to the next, within the chain, you see no double bonds, okay? It's just a single line going all the way through. So that would make an unsaturated fat one in which at least one of the fatty acid chains is not saturated with hydrogens. Now make sure you grasp that. A fat molecule has to have all three fatty acid chains saturated to be called a saturated fat. If at least one of those chains is not saturated, then the entire fat molecule is unsaturated. So if there's one or more carbons that's not completely bound to hydrogens, then what are they bonded to? Well, they're bonding to the carbons beside them, forming double bonds. So every unsaturated fat has at least one double bond. All right, so we can see that here in this illustration. And again, remember, it can be one of the fatty acid chains that has a double bond. It can be two of them or all three. As long as there's just one, then this entire fat molecule is considered an unsaturated fat. How does this difference affect the structure of a fat molecule? And what does this difference mean for us? Well, structurally, most unsaturated fats are going to have a kink in their structure because of the cis double bond. So that's what we're seeing right here. See how this one is bent? It's not going straight. So we call that a kink. All right. And here, right here is a cis double bond. Now, cis means that the hydrogens in the double bond are on the same side in space. So that's CIS for cis. Now that gets a little more into organic chemistry, but it's still good to know, especially for advanced biology. Saturated fats, on the other hand, are straight because they have no double bonds. So the lack of double bonds allows the atoms in the saturated fat molecule to pack closely together. This makes saturated fats solid at room temperature. They have high melting points. That means that it takes really high temperatures to start breaking those bonds inside of a saturated molecule. So what does this mean for us? From that health perspective, this means that we have to expend more energy to get the amount of heat that's required to break down the saturated fats that we take in. All right, so think about animal fats like lard or butter. These are saturated fats. Most animal fats are. Fish fat, on the other hand, is unsaturated. Now, if you sit butter, a stick of butter on the counter at room temperature, it's going to melt really slowly, if at all, just depending on the temperature in the room. If we go back to unsaturated fats, on the other hand, the atoms in unsaturated fat molecules are not packed as tightly together because of the double bonds. It doesn't allow them to pack that closely together. So this makes most unsaturated fats liquid at room temperature, and they're usually referred to as oils. Now, if you need a refresher or an introduction to solids versus liquids, then check out my video on properties of water. I'll link that below as well. So let's go back to the unsaturated fats though. That kink in their structure makes their bonds easier to break, meaning that they're going to have lower melting points than saturated fats. Most plant oils, except for coconut oil, are unsaturated. This means that it takes less energy for us to break down unsaturated fats that we take into our body. Unsaturated fats can be synthetically converted into saturated fats by having hydrogens added. So let's take a look at how that works here. So I've got one individual unsaturated fatty acid chain. Again, we've got this carboxylic acid at the end, and then the hydrocarbon skeleton. And here we see these two carbons. That's what makes this acid chain unsaturated, because they are not bound to the maximum number of hydrogens that they can be. This carbon's bound to only one hydrogen. It could have been bound to two. Same here. So we've got this double bond, and you see that puts a kink in the whole molecule. So this is an unsaturated fat. So through a man-made process called hydrogenation, hydrogens can be added to that chain, right? And now we've got this same hydrocarbon skeleton, but it's now saturated. So the double bond is gone. We now have a single bond between the two carbons. And before, they were each bonded to one hydrogen. Now they're each bonded to two hydrogens. All right, so I'm not going to count it here, but if you go through and count it, you'll see that this saturated fat has two more hydrogens. So again, that's a man-made process called hydrogenation. Now, for example, we have hydrogenated vegetable oils. All right, so this is what was naturally unsaturated oil, but hydrogen atoms were added to make it essentially a saturated fat. Sometimes during the hydrogenation process, trans double bonds are created. So trans double bonds are the opposite of cis double bonds. So if we go back here, remember I said a cis double bond is one where you have the hydrogens in the double bond on both sides in space. A trans double bond, like what we've got here, you have the hydrogens on different sides of the bond in space. Right, and we've also got another trans double bond right there. So that can happen during this synthetic process of changing an unsaturated fat to a saturated fat. So when we have fatty acid chains with these trans double bonds, then we get what are called trans fats. So hydrogenated fats, like these hydrogenated vegetable oils, and trans fats, like what you have in some of these different foods here, are not naturally occurring. They're both synthetically made. So that's a whole lot about the structure of fats. Their function is pretty simple. Fats store energy. That's what they do. Now they're similar to carbs in that aspect. Carbs store energy too, but 1 gram of fat is going to store about twice as much energy as 1 gram of carbohydrates. Fats are for living organisms what gasoline is for vehicles. And both fats and gasoline are made of long hydrocarbon chains. So in terms of sequence, what are our bodies going to use first for energy? Living organisms go first to carbs for energy because carbohydrate energy can be burned quickly. Fats have slow burning energy, so that's usually the next resort after the carbohydrate resource is depleted. So this is just a replica of fat in the human body here. And here we see 2 individual bodies. So let's look at this one. So here we can see on the front side of the body and towards the back. So here we see the stored up fat. So this is how we store fat for energy. All right, so here we see it in just the midsection, but fat can be stored in different parts of our body. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope it was helpful for you. If so, then please leave a thumbs up in the comments section below. And if you have any questions, then please type those in the comments and I'll do my best to provide you with an answer. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more easy to understand biology lessons. Thanks so much again for watching CCL Biology. That is Christ-Centered Life. Thanks, God bless, and bye-bye.